about this word prejudice. It is a sort of a problematic word. Gadamer is a bit apologetic about it, and he goes into the appropriate etymologies. The French préjugé, the German Vorurteil, all mean pre-judgment, a prior judgment, and they actually can be used in a court of law as a stage toward arriving at a verdict. They needn't be accompanied by popular prejudice against prejudice. As Gadamer says, this is the characteristic idea of the Enlightenment. It's prejudice against prejudice, that we can be objective, that we can free ourselves of okay, fine. But prejudice is bad. We have a right to we know prejudice is bad. We know what prejudice has wrought historically and socially. So how can we try to vindicate it in this way? It's extremely problematic. What Gadamer does in his essay is actually an act of intellectual conservatism. It has to be admitted. That whole section of the essay in which he talks about classicism, and you may have said to yourself as you were reading it, well, gee, isn't this sort of digressive? What's he so interested in classicism for? The whole section of the essay in which he's talking about classicism, and which he later calls tradition, is meant to suggest that we really can't merge horizons effectively unless we have a very broad and extensive common ground with what we're reading. And the great thing about classicism for Gadamer, or what he calls tradition, is that it's something we can share. The classical, Gadamer argues, is that which doesn't just speak to its own historical moment, but speaks for all time. Speaks to all of us in different ways, but does speak to us. That is to say, does proffer its claim to speak true. The classical can do that. Okay, great, we say to Gadamer. That's and certainly you're entitled to an intellectually conservative canon. Maybe other principles of hermeneutics will place much more stress on innovation or novelty or difference. But you're not sure people can understand unless they share a great deal of common ground. All well and good. But you know what? That's where the bad side of prejudice sneaks in. Slavery was considered perfectly appropriate and natural to a great many of the most exalted figures working within the tradition that Gadamer rightly calls classical. Classical antiquity, a great many modern figures never stopped to question slavery. Slavery was an aspect of classical culture which had its defenses. Well, Gadamer doesn't talk about this, obviously, but it is an aspect of that prejudice that one might share with tradition if one were somewhat more critical than this gesture of sharing might indicate. I just say that in passing, calling your attention to it as a risk that's involved in our engagement with a hermeneutic project of the nature of Gadamer's. And it's not to say that Gadamer favored slavery or anything of the sort. It is, however, to say that prejudice, while plainly we can understand it simply to mean preconception which is inescapable, and understand that philosophically, nevertheless can still be bad, and we have to understand the way in which it's something that, if we're going to accept this point of view, we need to live with. All right, now